what's going on with COVID and China. I think the biggest thing to underline is we really don't know what's going on. China has always been an information control space, but they have always been pretty good at collecting data, just not necessarily reporting it. Yes, there have been problems with their data collection, but what they share with the world just doesn't match what they see internally. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of folks like me just don't trust the data at all. But what they've done with this opening due to COVID is they've changed the policy completely. Instead of collecting data and lying about it, they're just not collecting it. So, supposedly only a few dozen people have died in total from COVID in the last couple of years. They were reporting officially back in December that they had a few thousand new cases, but we know now that the new case tally is in excess of a couple of million a day. Some independent estimates say it's in over 20 or 30 million. We also don't know much about the virus, and this is where things get a little scary. COVID, it changes relatively rapidly. We've been seeing new variants every few months. But in China, now that we have over 1 billion people who have been exposed all at once, it's a different sort of scenario. So you can certainly argue that very few countries in the world got it right when it comes to managing COVID. I mean, we've all kind of been making this up as we go along because the goalposts have keep moving. And whether you believe in natural immunity or vaccinated immunity, most people who are willing to, not be morons about it will admit that people on the other side have a point that is worth considering. This hasn't been in play in China. The Chinese vaccines have been proven over and over and over again by almost every country that has tried to use them to be broadly ineffective at preventing COVID. And so most countries that originally started using the Chinese formulas have switched to other formulas that come from different countries. India does their own. Obviously, the Western countries have their own. The Russians have their own. And some of these are better than others, but the Chinese are definitely at the bottom of the barrel. And so they've pretty much vanished from global use. The Chinese also aren't going to have an mRNA formula for at least a couple of years, or at least not one that's probably ready for prime time. So that's an issue for another day rather than the outbreaks that we're seeing in China right now, which means what's going on in China is something that's very difficult to predict. There are two factors when it comes to COVID, or really any pathogen. First of all, you need to know it's R0 or it's R0, and that's the number of people on average that each infected person will then contaminate. And then the second thing, of course, is lethality. What's your chance of actually dying from this thing? Now, it takes time to figure that out because you first have to wait for the virus to mutate, and then you have to wait for it to get into a general population, and then you have to collect the data, and then you have to wait to see if people are going to die and collect that data too. So on average, from the point that a new variant emerges to the point that we have a decent grip on how communicable and how lethal it is, it's usually around 6 months. And that's one of the reasons why policy across the world has been so schizophrenic, because policymakers are attempting to figure out what to do for health policy before they have the data. And if you wait until after you have the data, you may have lost a few 100,000 people already, and we've seen that time and time again around the world. Now, the Chinese are struggling with this at the moment, just like everybody else, just on a much grander scale, because so few people in the country have any sort of real resistance. Until recently, no one's had COVID, and then, of course, the vaccines are not all that great. But for the rest of us, China choosing to not share data, but China choosing to not even collect data means that we can have literally millions of deaths in China, and the rest of the world doesn't know what to get ready for. We can't even begin the process of understanding what the new variants that are circulating in China are going to mean for the rest of us. So we know there are at least 7 different variants. We knew that back in December. We also knew that at least 2 of those variants didn't exist 2 to 3 months previous. So the only data that has existed was back in December, before this all blew up, when the Chinese were still lying about everything. Now they're not even collecting the data, so we are not going to have a good idea of what we're going to be struggling with until 6 months after this virus breaks out of the Chinese population and into the global commons. So, could be nothing. Maybe this is the most mild variant yet. Could be horrible. This could be the most lethal variant yet. We just don't know, and we won't know for months.
The Chinese have discontinued their use of their social monitoring app for COVID. which a lot of people thought it was never going to go away because it was great for social control, but they've got other methods for doing it, so I was never really overly concerned there. If you got mild symptoms, you can recover from home rather than having to go to a quarantine clinic, and the quarantine clinics are about what you would expect from a government institution where people don't have a choice where they can go. They were basically prisons that had a modicum of medical assistance, and they were not particularly hygienic, and a lot of people got co-infections that came from their times there. There's also room now for provincial and local governments to set and lessen restrictions of their own for the first times. And we are seeing a general mobilization of the health system across the Chinese system to deal with the anticipated surge in cases, and it's wildly, wildly insufficient. Lots of businesses are closed. A lot of the testing facilities are closed because they can't find enough workers who are not infected to do the tests in the first place. So China's data has always been sketchy at best, and now in many cases they're not even attempting to generate it. We're also seeing significant shortages of common pharmacy items and drugs and anything you'd use to treat flu-like symptoms. The scale of what's coming is kind of difficult to wrap your mind around. So the United States has 330 million people, and one of the common criticisms of the American healthcare system, which is accurate, is that our healthcare system is awful at actually keeping people healthy, but it's excellent at providing critical care. The Chinese system is not good at keeping people healthy either, and it sucks at providing critical care. And in the case of the United States, with our 330 million people, we still lost over 1 million citizens over the 3 years of the epidemic to date. Now, the Chinese deaths to this point have been a rounding error because the Chinese have succeeded in keeping the general population away from the virus, and they, deserve some kudos for that. But the Chinese population is not nearly as healthy as the American population, if you can imagine that. On average, the population is older, has been for about a decade, and if some new data revisions that they're working on prove true, probably closer to 2. And in relative terms, more Chinese are diabetic than Americans, and that is generally proven to be like the number one comorbidity factor when you're looking at COVID. And all of a sudden, this is all going down at once. I think that the best way to think about this is if you think about the American COVID experience through 2020, 2021, and 2022, things came in phases. We were first exposed to the original virus, and then we had Alpha, and then we had Delta, and then we had Omicron. And about the time that Alpha was popping up, we were getting mass vaccination in play with mRNA vaccines that proved to be wildly effective. And so we had our initial death wave. And then we had our vaccination, and then we had the Delta wave, and then we had this mass infection with Omicron at the beginning of this year. So pretty much everyone in the United States has now been exposed to at least one of the strains, most of us 2 or more. And most of us have gotten vaccinated, and with a plurality of those people actually getting boosted. People like me have, immunocompromised. I think I've had 5 shots now. The point is it didn't happen all at once. And we all have experienced a degree of exposure and protection. The Chinese don't have that. The Chinese vaccine was barely functional against the original wild strain out of Wuhan. Against the current strain, it doesn't work at all. And say what you will about the Chinese health system, the lockdowns, the perpetual lockdowns, did succeed at limiting exposure, so no one has natural immunity either. So you cut all this loose at the same time, and we're talking millions of deaths, because the R0 for the current strain, what's the best way to do this? Let me compare it to measles. So measles has an R0 of 12 to 18, which means your average infected person will then go on to infect another 12 to 18 people. I have not seen an estimate out of China suggesting that the current strain is better than measles. Most indicated it's worse. There's an open question of fatality rates, and that, of course, is where the Chinese are doing their normal makeup data as they go along. They're projecting that the death rate is 100 per 100,000 infections, which would be about the same death rate you get from stubbing your toe. And that is just obviously laughable. It'd be less severe than what the flu is. More likely, we're looking at something at least 15 to 20 times that. At least that's what data from the rest of the world would suggest. So from a health point of view, what's about to happen is just horrific. We're talking probably millions of deaths in a relatively short period of time, as 3 years of exposure American style has been compressed into just a few weeks, and it was kicked off with several hundred super spreader events during the protests.